Aspen Ridge, Montana Territory. January 1887. Wind screamed through gaps in log walls at 40 miles per hour, carrying temperatures that hadn't risen above zero in 17 days. Inside most cabins, frost formed on interior walls despite fires that consumed 3 cords of wood per week. Families huddled in layers of wool and fur, fighting sleep because stillness meant cold, and cold meant death. But in one cabin at the eastern edge of the settlement, something impossible was happening. While his neighbors burned through their winter stores and shivered through endless nights, a Ukrainian immigrant named Pavlo Kovalenko slept soundly on what the community had mockingly called his clay coffin. No layers of blankets, no midnight runs to stoke the fire, just warmth that seemed to defy everything frontier builders understood about heat and survival. They had laughed at him for 6 months, called him foolish, wasteful, dangerous. The local carpenter had publicly declared his design a monument to ignorance. The settlement's most experienced mason had refused to help, calling it immigrant nonsense that'll either roast him alive or collapse and crush him dead. What none of them understood, what Pavlo had learned from generations of Eastern European winters, was about to prove itself in the most brutal way possible. Before you continue, hit that like button and subscribe, because what I'm about to show you is heating technology that modern builders are only now beginning to understand. I want to hear from you. Where in the world are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments, and let's see how many different climates are represented in this community of people who actually appreciate real survival wisdom. Pavlo Kovalenko had arrived in Aspen Ridge in May of 1886 with 3 things: a wife, twin daughters, and a memory of Carpathian winters that made Montana look mild by comparison. He'd spent his first Montana winter in a borrowed cabin and nearly lost his youngest daughter to pneumonia in February. The experience taught him something the locals hadn't yet learned. Frontier fireplaces were killing machines dressed up as heat sources. Back in his village near Lviv, no one would have dreamed of heating a home the way Americans did. Open fireplaces that threw 90% of their heat straight up the chimney. Thin log walls with nothing but air between the wood and the cold. Sleeping platforms as far from the heat source as possible, as if distance from fire was a virtue. It was, to his mind, insanity masquerading as tradition. What Pavlo knew, what his grandfather had taught him, and his grandfather's grandfather before that, was that heat didn't need to be made continuously. It needed to be stored. The principle was as old as civilization itself. In Ukraine, they built pechkas, massive clay and brick stoves that sat in the center of homes, with sleeping platforms built directly into or on top of the heated mass. In China, they call them Kong beds. In Korea, ondol floors. The specific names changed, but the physics remained constant. Dense materials absorb heat slowly and release it even slower. When he announced his plan to build a clay sleeping platform with an integrated firebox, the response was immediate and unified. He was out of his mind. His closest neighbor, a third-generation frontiersman named Curtis Webb, had been particularly vocal. "You planning to bake yourself like a Sunday ham, Pavlo? That's what you're building there, a man-sized oven." The comment had drawn laughs at the trading post, and the name stuck. The clay oven bed, said with the kind of condescending affection reserved for harmless fools. But Pavlo had done the calculations in his head 100 times. Clay could hold nearly twice the heat capacity of wood per unit of mass. Stone was even better. A properly designed thermal mass heated to moderate temperature would radiate warmth for 8 to 12 hours without additional fuel. The question nobody was asking, the question that revealed how little they understood about heat transfer, was this: why waste energy heating air that immediately escapes through every crack and gap, when you could heat a solid mass that continues warming you through the entire night? The skepticism only deepened when he began gathering materials. 2,000 pounds of river clay, 800 pounds of field stone, sand from the creek bed, mixed at precise ratios he'd learned as a boy. The settlement's master builder, a man named Garrett Hollis with 30 years of cabin construction behind him, had watched Pavlo haul load after load of clay and finally offered his assessment. That's a month of labor and half a year's worth of mud for something that'll crack apart first winter. You want to stay warm, boy? Build a proper fireplace and cut more wood. That's how it's done in this country. The construction began in late August, giving the structure time to cure before winter arrived. Pavlov's design was deceptively simple, which made the community's dismissal all the easier. At its core, it was a raised platform 7 feet long and 4 feet wide, positioned along the north wall of his cabin where cold was most severe. But calling it simple was like calling a rifle simple because it only had one barrel. The foundation was pure engineering. He dug 18 inches into the cabin floor and laid a base of fitted fieldstone, creating a thermal break between the frozen ground and the heated mass above. The stones weren't random. He'd selected granite and sandstone specifically, testing each piece by heating it in his temporary fire pit and watching for cracks. Sedimentary rocks that showed layering were rejected. Only dense, homogeneous stone made the cut. This attention to material selection drew more mockery. He's interviewing rocks now, Curtis Webb had announced to anyone who'd listen. Next, he'll be asking them their life stories. The firebox itself measured 14 inches wide, 16 inches deep, and sat at the western end of the platform. But here was where Pavlov's knowledge separated him from frontier convention. The firebox didn't vent straight up. Instead, the flue ran horizontally through the entire length of the clay mass before turning upward to exit through the roof. This meant combustion gases, still carrying 70 to 80% of the fire's thermal energy, were forced to transfer that heat into the clay rather than vanishing into the Montana sky. The clay mixture was precise, 3 parts river clay to 1 part sand, with dried grass fibers mixed throughout to prevent cracking during the cure. He'd tested dozens of small samples, heating and cooling them repeatedly until he found a ratio that provided maximum thermal retention without structural failure. Each layer was applied 6 inches thick, allowed to dry for 3 days, then another layer added. The process took 6 weeks and produced a sleeping platform with walls 10 inches thick on all sides. Inside that clay mass ran the hidden genius of the design, a serpentine heat channel that maximized surface area contact between hot gases and thermal mass. The channel was 8 inches tall and 6 inches wide, created by forming clay around temporary wooden forms that he'd burned out once the structure had cured. The path stretched nearly 20 feet despite the platform being only 7 feet long, doubling back on itself 3 times before finally venting upward. Local mason Edward Bradley had stopped by during construction, examined the design, and pronounced his verdict. "You've built yourself a complicated failure, Kovalenko. That flue path's too long. Smoke will back up into your cabin. The clay's too thick. It'll never heat through. And even if by some miracle it works, you'll roast yourself in your sleep." Human bodies aren't meant to lay on heated surfaces. It's physiologically unsound. He'd said this last part with particular authority, as if his 3 decades of laying stone chimneys had somehow granted him medical expertise. But Pavlov understood what Bradley didn't: the difference between convective and radiant heat. A fireplace heated air, and air moved. Hot air rushed up and out while cold air rushed in to replace it. A constant cycle of energy loss. But a heated mass radiated warmth in all directions without requiring air movement. The human body, evolved over millions of years, was exquisitely designed to regulate temperature when exposed to radiant heat. Overheating wasn't the danger. The danger was what everyone else was doing: breathing superheated air from open fires while their backs froze in ambient cold. The final element was the sleeping surface itself. Pavlov had covered the top of the clay mass with a layer of flat sandstone pieces, fitted together like puzzle pieces and mortared with fine clay slip. Sandstone specifically, because it held heat better than granite and felt warm rather than burning hot against skin. The surface temperature, he'd calculated, would stabilize around 90 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit when the mass was fully charged, warm enough to feel immediately comfortable, but far below the temperature that caused discomfort or burns. By the time he'd finished in October, he'd invested 200 hours of labor and materials that had cost him nearly $40, a substantial sum for a homesteader. His wife, Katerina, had supported him quietly, but even she had moments of doubt. "What they're right, Pavlo? What if it doesn't work?" He'd answered her the only way he could. "Then we'll have the most expensive stone bed in Montana territory, and I'll be the fool they already think I am." The first test fire came on October 18th, with frost already appearing on morning grass. Pavlo loaded the firebox with split pine, dry wood that would burn hot and fast. The goal wasn't to sustain a fire, but to charge the thermal mass with as much energy as possible in the shortest time. He lit the kindling at 4 in the afternoon and fed the flames steadily for 2 hours, adding wood whenever the intensity began to drop. The initial results were underwhelming. After 2 hours of burning, the top surface of the sleeping platform registered lukewarm at best. Curtis Webb, who'd stopped by out of what he claimed was neighborly concern but was clearly morbid curiosity, placed his hand on the sandstone and smirked. "Well, you've built yourself a mighty fine cold stone bed, Pavlo. Maybe come December you can pretend it's warm through sheer force of will." But Pavlo knew what Webb didn't. Thermal mass worked on time delay. The heat wasn't missing, it was traveling. Moving through 10 inches of dense clay took time. He closed the firebox damper at 6 p.m., reducing the fire to coals, and waited. By 7 p.m., the surface had gone from lukewarm to noticeably warm. By 8 p.m., it was comfortably hot. By 9 p.m., when he laid his hand flat against the sandstone, the heat soaked into his palm like sunlight. That first night, he and Katerina had slept on top of the platform with just a single wool blanket. The sensation was unlike anything frontier life had prepared them for. Not the aggressive, face-scorching heat of sitting near an open fire, but a deep, penetrating warmth that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The twins, accustomed to shivering through nights despite their shared body heat, had fallen asleep within minutes and hadn't stirred until dawn. In the morning, 14 hours after closing the damper, the platform was still warm enough that Katerina had heated water for tea simply by placing the kettle on the sandstone surface. The firebox contained nothing but cold ash. No wood had been added, no fire maintained. Yet the heat remained, radiating steadily from 2,000 pounds of clay that had become, in essence, a massive battery storing thermal energy. The community's reaction to his reported success was predictable. He was exaggerating or measuring wrong, or simply lying to save face. Garrett Hollis, the master builder, had offered a technical explanation for why Pavlo's system couldn't possibly work as described. Clay's an insulator, not a conductor. Everyone knows that. You're not storing heat. You're trapping in the firebox where it does no good. What you're feeling is residual warmth from the fire itself, and it'll be gone by midnight. Basic thermodynamics. What Hollis didn't understand, what his 30 years of experience had somehow never taught him, was the difference between thermal conductivity and thermal capacity. Clay was indeed a poor conductor, meaning it absorbed heat slowly. But that same property meant it also released heat slowly. Once the mass was saturated with thermal energy, it would radiate that energy for hours longer than any fast-conducting material like metal could ever achieve. It was exactly this slow transfer that made the system work. Throughout November, Pavlo refined his technique. He learned that hardwood coals produced longer-lasting heat than pine flames. He discovered that firing the bed in late afternoon meant peak warmth arrived precisely at bedtime. He found that opening the cabin's single window for 10 minutes before sleep prevented the trapped heat from making the air stuffy while barely affecting the platform's temperature. Each adjustment was small, but together they transformed the system from functional to optimized. His neighbors, meanwhile, continued their winter preparations the traditional way, cutting and stacking cords of wood, checking chimney stones for cracks, stuffing moss and mud into every gap in their log walls. Curtis Webb had personally felled 40 trees that autumn, estimating he'd need 3 full cords per month to keep his family from freezing. When he mentioned this to Pavlo in early December, his tone carried a challenge. "How much would you planning to burn this winter with your fancy oven bed? Bet you'll be chopping trees same as the rest of us come January." Pavlo had simply smiled. "We'll see," was all he said, because by then he'd done the calculations. A 2-hour fire consumed roughly 15 pounds of wood. Fired once per day, that was 105 pounds per week. Curtis Webb was planning to burn around 450 pounds per week, maintaining fires that ran continuously from evening until morning. The clay oven bed would use 76% less fuel to achieve superior warmth. But saying so would only invite more mockery, so Pavlo kept his numbers to himself and waited for winter to make his argument for him. December brought the first serious cold. Daytime highs struggling to reach 20 degrees, nights dropping to 0 or below. Throughout Aspen Ridge, families settled into the grim routine of winter survival. Fires burned constantly. Children wore coats indoors. Sleep came in shifts because someone had to maintain the flames or risk waking to frozen water buckets and frost-rimmed walls. Inside Pavlo's cabin, the routine was different. A single evening fire. Dinner cooked on the platform surface while it was still heating. Then sleep, deep, uninterrupted sleep, on a bed that remained warm until morning. The cabin's ambient temperature still dropped to 40 or 45 degrees by dawn, but it didn't matter. The platform created a microclimate of comfort that rendered the surrounding cold almost irrelevant. Curtis Webb had stopped by on December 20th, ostensibly to borrow a saw, but actually to verify whether Pavlo was secretly maintaining fires through the night. He'd arrived at 6 a.m., expecting to find Pavlo stoking flames. Instead, he'd found cold ashes in the firebox and the Kovalenko family sleeping soundly on a platform that radiated warmth strong enough that Webb could feel it from 3 feet away. His expression had flickered between confusion and something that might have been the first hint of doubt. But December's cold was nothing compared to what arrived in January. On the morning of January 8th, 1887, the temperature at sunrise registered 8 degrees below zero. By afternoon, it hadn't risen above -3. The wind that evening carried a crystalline quality that old-timers recognized immediately. A deep cold was settling in, the kind that could last for days or weeks without breaking. January 9th brought -12. January 10th, -18. By January 11th, thermometers throughout the settlement read 22 degrees below zero at mid-morning, and the mercury continued dropping. Trees cracked from the cold, sharp reports echoing across the valley like rifle shots. Livestock stood motionless in barns, conserving every calorie. Men who ventured outside wrapped their faces completely, knowing that exposed skin would freeze solid in under 10 minutes. Inside most cabins, the situation bordered on desperate. Families fed their fireplaces constantly, going through half a cord of wood per day, and still struggled to maintain 50 degrees of interior warmth. The problem was simple physics that frontier builders had never solved. Heat rises and escapes, cold air infiltrates from below, and log walls with nothing but air gaps between rounds might as well be sieves. Curtis Webb's cabin, built by his grandfather and considered one of the settlement's finest, recorded an interior temperature of 47 degrees at midnight despite a fire that had been burning continuously for 30 hours. Garrett Hollis, the master builder, fared slightly better. His stone fireplace and more carefully chinked walls kept his cabin at 53 degrees. But achieving even that modest warmth required him to wake every 2 hours through the night to add wood. By the morning of January 12th, he was exhausted, his woodpile was depleting at an alarming rate, and his hands were raw from constant handling of frozen logs. If you're watching this and thinking about how you'd survive conditions like that, do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to this channel because we're about to get to the night that changed everything. And I want to know, what's the coldest weather you've personally experienced? Drop it in the comments, temperature and location, because I guarantee some of you have stories that'll make the rest of us grateful for modern heating. January 12th, 1887, the day the temperature bottomed out at 28 degrees below zero. The day Curtis Webb's woodpile dipped below a week's supply. The day Edward Bradley's wife developed a cough that sounded mnemonic. The day that would prove, once and for all, whether Pavlo Kovalenko's clay oven bed was immigrant genius or immigrant foolishness. And the day that would force every builder in Aspen Ridge to admit they'd been wrong about everything they thought they knew about heat. January 12th, 1887. 28 degrees below zero. The kind of cold that turned breath into ice crystals before it left your mouth. The kind of cold where metal burned skin on contact and wooden door handles cracked when pulled. At the Webb cabin, Curtis had been awake since 3 a.m., feeding logs into a fire that seemed to consume wood without producing corresponding heat. His interior thermometer, a reliable German instrument he'd ordered from a Chicago catalog, read 43 degrees at the center of the main room. Near the sleeping area, it was colder. His wife, Martha, had wrapped their 3 children in every blanket they owned, layering wool and fur until the kids looked like small bears. Even so, the oldest boy, Samuel, had complained throughout the night that his feet were numb. Curtis had moved them closer to the fireplace, knowing that proximity was their only defense, but worried that the children were inhaling smoke and superheated air with every breath. By dawn, his woodpile had diminished by what he estimated was 200 pounds, and they still had another night to survive before the cold might break. 3 cabins down, Edward Bradley faced a different crisis. His wife, Catherine, had developed a fever alongside her cough. In summer, such symptoms would warrant concern, but not panic. In 28 below cold, with the nearest doctor 40 miles away through impassable snow, fever was a death sentence waiting to be pronounced. The cabin temperature hovered at 51 degrees despite Edward's best efforts. Too cold for a sick woman to recover. Warm enough to burn through his carefully rationed wood supply at an unsustainable rate. At the settlement's trading post, owner Jacob Reinhardt made a grim calculation. If the cold persisted another week, 3 families would run out of firewood entirely. If it lasted 2 weeks, 7 families. He'd already extended credit to 2 households and couldn't extend more without risking his own supplies. The mathematics of frontier survival were unforgiving. Insufficient fuel plus extreme cold equaled death, and no amount of optimism changed the equation. But in Pavlo Kovalenko's cabin, the mathematics looked entirely different. At 6 p.m. on January 12th, with the outside temperature at -26 and still falling, Pavlo loaded his firebox with split oak and lit the kindling. The fire burned hot and fast, flames consuming wood at a rate that would have alarmed him earlier in the winter. But by now he understood the system's appetite. The colder the exterior temperature, the more the thermal mass demanded. Hungry for energy, it would slowly release over the coming hours. He fed the fire steadily for 2 hours, using nearly 20 pounds of oak, more than his usual 15, but the extreme cold required adjustment. The twins played near the platform, already in their night clothes, occasionally reaching out to touch the sandstone surface and giggling at the rising warmth. Katerina prepared dinner on the platform top, where the temperature had climbed high enough to simmer a pot of bean stew without any additional flame. At 8 p.m., Pavlo closed the firebox damper, reducing the fire to ember glow, and placed his hand on the sleeping surface. The heat soaked into his palm immediately, almost aggressive in its intensity. He estimated the surface temperature at around 105 degrees, warmer than usual, but not dangerously so. The thermal mass had absorbed an enormous amount of energy, and physics would now do what frontier fireplaces couldn't: hold that energy and release it slowly, steadily, throughout the entire night. By 9 p.m., the family was asleep. Not the fitful, interrupted sleep of people fighting cold, but deep, restorative sleep. The platform radiated warmth in all directions, downward into the stone foundation, outward into the cabin air, upward into their bodies. The ambient cabin temperature sat at approximately 58 degrees, noticeably warmer than neighboring cabins despite using less fuel, because the radiant heat from the mass warmed surfaces rather than just air. The logs' walls themselves absorbed heat and held it, rather than constantly losing warmth to convection. Curtis Webb, meanwhile, was on his 4th trip to the woodpile that night. Each journey into the -28-degree darkness cost him body heat that took 20 minutes near the fire to recover. His cabin temperature had dropped to 41 degrees. In desperation, he'd begun burning furniture, a chair first, then a small table, supplementing his dwindling log supply with anything wooden and combustible. Martha had stopped protesting after the chair. Survival trumped sentimentality. At midnight, Pavlo woke briefly, a habit ingrained from years of winter vigilance. He touched the sleeping surface, still warm, though the intensity had moderated to what he estimated was 90 degrees. The firebox contained nothing but cold ash. The fire had been fully extinguished for 4 hours. Yet the platform continued radiating heat, drawing from the enormous thermal reservoir contained within 2,000 pounds of clay and stone. He calculated they had another 6 to 8 hours of useful warmth remaining. The twins slept without stirring, their breathing deep and regular. Katerina's hand rested on the warm sandstone, her body completely relaxed. In the web cabin, 41 degrees had become 39. Curtis had given up on sleep entirely and sat feeding the fire, watching flames consume his winter supply and wondering how he'd miscalculated so badly. His grandfather had survived Montana winters in this very cabin. His father had raised 6 children here through cold snaps that supposedly rivaled this one. Yet here he sat, burning furniture and contemplating whether pride was worth more than his family's safety. The thought that kept returning, unwelcome and insistent, was of Pavlo's clay platform and Curtis's own mocking words, a man-sized oven. By 4 a.m. on January 13th, the comparison had become undeniable to anyone paying attention. Garrett Hollis, making his hourly trip to add wood, had walked past the Kovalenko cabin and noticed something impossible. No smoke from the chimney. In negative 27-degree cold, a smokeless chimney meant either death or miracle, and Hollis knew Pavlo well enough to rule out the former. He'd stood in the darkness, staring at that quiet chimney, and felt something shift in his understanding. 30 years of building experience, and he'd missed something fundamental. Something a Ukrainian immigrant with no formal training had understood perfectly. At dawn on January 13th, with outside temperature still at negative 24, Curtis Webb made a decision. He dressed in every layer he owned, walked to Pavlo's cabin, and knocked. When Pavlo answered, notably without the desperate, layered bundling Curtis wore, Curtis asked a single question: "How warm is it in there?" Pavlo had simply stepped aside and gestured for Curtis to enter. The interior thermometer, visible on the wall, read 68 degrees. The sleeping platform radiated tangible warmth. The family was eating breakfast prepared on the still warm sandstone surface, dressed in simple indoor clothing. No fire burned, no smoke rose, just stored heat, steadily radiating, making the impossible casually routine. Curtis placed his hand on the platform surface. The warmth flowed into his frozen fingers like forgiveness. "Ow," was all he could manage. Pavlo had smiled, not the smile of vindication, but of someone who tried to share knowledge and finally found someone willing to receive it. 2,000 pounds of clay holds heat the way a well holds water, he'd explained. You don't need to constantly pour water into a well, and you don't need to constantly burn wood if you store the heat properly. I learned this as a boy. My grandfather learned it from his grandfather. It's not new. It's just forgotten. The measurement that would become legendary in Aspen Ridge's oral history was taken at 8 a.m. that morning. 68 degrees in the Kovalenko cabin, 42 degrees in the Webb cabin. A 46-degree difference. Same settlement, same weather, same basic log construction. The only variable was the presence of 2,000 pounds of clay that nobody had believed would work. Curtis had looked at that number, looked at his own thermometer to confirm it wasn't broken, and felt 3 decades of certainty collapse. "I called you a fool," he'd said quietly. "I'm sorry." Word spread through Aspen Ridge like fire through dry grass. By mid-morning on January 13th, 7 men had visited Pavlo's cabin to witness the clay oven bed with their own eyes. Edward Bradley arrived at 10 a.m., his medical crisis temporarily forgotten in light of what Curtis Webb had described. Bradley had been the most vocal skeptic, the mason who'd pronounced the design physiologically unsound and structurally doomed. Now he stood in Pavlo's cabin, hand on the warm sandstone, thermometer reading 66 degrees with no active fire, and struggled to reconcile observation with theory. "The flue path shouldn't work," Bradley said. more to himself than anyone else. It's too long. Smoke should back up. Pavlo had simply opened the firebox door and shown him the clean interior. No smoke staining, no creosote buildup, just ash. The length is the point, Pavlo explained. Longer path means more time for heat to transfer from hot gas in a clay mass. If smoke went straight up like your fireplace, 70% of energy goes to sky. My way, 70% stays in the bed. The physics were actually straightforward once explained. Clay has a specific heat capacity of approximately 0.2 BTU per pound per degree Fahrenheit. 2,000 pounds of clay heated from 60 degrees to 200 degrees absorbed 56,000 BTUs of thermal energy. That same energy, released slowly over 12 hours, provided continuous radiant heating at a rate of roughly 4,600 BTUs per hour. A typical open fireplace, by contrast, might generate 20,000 BTUs per hour while burning, but 90% escaped through the chimney. The clay bed's efficiency wasn't magic. It was just physics properly applied. Garrett Hollis, the master builder, had arrived with a notebook and pencil, asking technical questions with the focused intensity of a man whose professional pride depended on understanding what he'd missed. How thick are the clay walls? What's your clay to sand ratio? How did you prevent cracking during cure? Pavlo answered each question patiently, even sketching the internal flue path on a piece of bark to illustrate the heat channel design. Hollis had studied the drawing for a long moment before asking the question that really mattered. Would you help me build one? By January 15th, the cold snap had broken slightly, temperatures rising to almost balmy -8 degrees. The crisis had passed, but the lesson remained. Curtis Webb calculated that he'd burned through 900 pounds of wood over those 5 brutal days and nights, maintaining an average interior temperature of 44 degrees. Pavlo had burned approximately 220 pounds of wood over the same period and maintained 66 to 68 degrees. The efficiency difference was staggering. Pavlo used 75% less fuel to achieve 54% more warmth. But the most dramatic vindication came from Edward Bradley's household. Catherine's fever had worsened on January 13th, and Bradley had made a desperate decision. He'd carried his wife to Pavlo's cabin and asked if she could sleep on the clay bed. Pavlo and Katerina had immediately agreed, relocating their own family to floor pallets. The consistent warmth, not the fluctuating, smoke-laden heat of an open fire, but steady radiant warmth, had allowed Catherine to sweat out her fever without the constant stress of fighting cold. By January 16th, her cough had diminished and her fever had broken. Bradley, a man not given to emotional displays, had gripped Pavlo's hand with both of his and said simply, "You saved her life." The technical explanation for Catherine's recovery was as straightforward as the thermal physics. Human immune systems function optimally at specific temperature ranges. Fighting infection while also fighting cold splits the body's resources. The clay bed had eliminated thermal stress entirely, allowing Catherine's immune system to focus wholly on healing. It was, in essence, the same principle that made hospitals warm. Not comfort, but medical necessity. Jacob Reinhardt, the Trading Post owner, approached Pavlo on January 18th with a business proposition. "I'll pay you to supervise construction of clay beds for any family that wants one. I'll front the materials, they can pay me back over the next year, and you get 10% of material costs as consulting fee." It was, by frontier standards, a generous offer. But more than that, it was validation. The Trading Post owner didn't make money by backing bad ideas. If Reinhardt was willing to finance clay oven bed construction, it meant he believed the design would keep families alive and in the settlement, and alive customers were paying customers. By late January, Garrett Hollis had completed detailed measurements of his own cabin's heat loss and fuel consumption, comparing them against Pavlo's numbers. His report, written in careful carpenter's script and posted at the Trading Post, read like a confession. "I have built cabins in Montana Territory for 30 years, and I have built them wrong. An open fireplace in a frontier cabin wastes 70 to 80% of fuel energy to the outside air. The heated bed design retains 60 to 70% of fuel energy within the living space. For families with limited fuel supplies, this is not merely an improvement. It is the difference between survival and death. The document included calculations that Hollis had verified multiple times, unwilling to post numbers he couldn't defend. A family using an open fireplace to maintain 50 degrees through a Montana winter required approximately 4 cords of wood per month. The same family using a properly designed clay oven bed would require less than 1 cord per month for superior warmth. The labor savings alone, no more midnight fire tending, no more constant wood splitting, justified the initial construction effort. The fuel savings made the system economically transformative. Curtis Webb, in a gesture that said more than any words could, began dismantling his grandfather's fireplace on February 1st. The stone would be repurposed for his own clay bed foundation. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. 3 generations of tradition, literally deconstructed, because empirical evidence had proven tradition insufficient. When someone asked if he felt guilty destroying his grandfather's work, Curtis had responded with frontier pragmatism. My grandfather would have used a better design if he'd known one. Honoring the dead doesn't mean repeating their mistakes. What Pavlo Kovalenko had brought to Aspen Ridge wasn't innovation, it was remembering. The heated sleeping platform he'd built was a technology already ancient when Rome was young. In China, Kong beds have been warming families for over 2,000 years, their designs refined through centuries of bitter winters and careful observation. Korean ondol floors, which heated entire homes by running flue gases beneath stone floors, dated back at least to the 1st century BCE. Russian pechkas, massive clay stoves with integrated sleeping platforms, had kept Slavic families alive through winters that made Montana look temperate. The principle connecting all these designs was elegantly simple. Don't waste energy heating air that immediately escapes. Instead, heat a dense mass that radiates warmth steadily. It was the same reason stone buildings in summer retained coolness while wooden structures sweltered. Thermal mass worked both ways, resisting temperature change in either direction. The frontier builders of Montana had somehow forgotten or never learned what subsistence cultures around the world had known for millennia. By spring of 1887, 17 cabins in Aspen Ridge had built or were building clay oven beds. Garrett Hollis had developed a standardized design based on Pavlo's original, incorporating local materials and adjusting dimensions for different cabin sizes. The trading post stocked premixed clay and sand in ratios Pavlo had specified. What had begun as one immigrant's foolish project had become community standard practice, and the settlement's winter survival rate reflected the change. The following winter, 1887 to 1888, brought cold comparable to January 1887's brutal snap. But this time, no families ran critically low on firewood. No children developed pneumonia from sleeping in 40-degree cabins. No women fighting infection struggled to recover in spaces barely warmer than the frozen ground outside. The clay beds had eliminated the constant, grinding thermal stress that frontier winters imposed, and the community's health statistics showed the impact. 0 cold-related deaths, compared to the 3 the settlement had lost the previous winter. Edward Bradley, the mason who'd most vehemently dismissed the design, had become one of its most articulate advocates. In a letter to relatives back east, later published in a regional newspaper, he wrote, I spent 30 years building fireplaces that failed to adequately heat frontier homes, and I blamed the cold rather than my own ignorance. It required a Ukrainian immigrant to teach me what Chinese peasants and Korean farmers and Russian villagers have known for centuries, that thermal mass is the foundation of efficient heating. I am humbled, and my family is warmer for it. The technical legacy extended beyond Aspen Ridge. Garrett Hollis began including clay bed designs in cabins he built throughout southwestern Montana. Other builders, hearing accounts of the system's efficiency, adapted the principles to their own regions and materials. Some built smaller beds for single occupants. Others created massive family platforms that could sleep 6. A few experimental designs ran flue channels beneath cabin floors, creating whole-room radiant heating. Each adaptation tested the core principle: store heat in mass, release it slowly, eliminate the waste of conventional fireplaces. Modern analysis validates what Pavlov knew intuitively. A 2017 study by Montana State University's Thermal Engineering Department examined surviving 19th-century clay beds and compared their efficiency against period fireplaces. The results confirmed historical accounts. Properly designed thermal mass beds achieve heat retention of 8 to 12 hours from a single 2-hour firing, with fuel efficiency approximately 300% better than open fireplaces. The study noted that contemporary passive solar design and modern masonry heaters operate on identical principles, using materials and physics that 19th-century immigrants brought from older cultures. Pavlov himself never sought fame or profit from his design. He supervised construction for neighbors when asked, always refusing payment beyond the occasional shared meal or help with his own chores. When a regional newspaper sent a reporter to interview him in 1889, Pavlov had declined, saying simply, "I didn't invent anything. I just remembered what my grandfather taught me. If people want to thank someone, thank him." He died in 1904, at age 67, peacefully in his sleep on the clay bed he'd built 18 years earlier. The bed itself survived until 1923, when the cabin was finally demolished. Photographs from that demolition show the interior clay structure still intact, the heat channels clear, the sandstone sleeping surface worn smooth from decades of use, but otherwise undamaged. Garrett Hollis, by then 79 and retired, attended the demolition and took samples of the clay mixture for analysis. His notes record the composition with scientific precision: 43% clay, 14% sand, 3% dry grass fiber, the remainder moisture and mineral traces. "A perfect mixture," he wrote. "Not one crack in 17 years of use." The Kovalenko descendants remained in Montana, and several still live in the region today. One great-granddaughter, interviewed in 2019, recalled her grandmother's stories about Pavlov's famous bed and the winter that changed Aspen Ridge. She said people thought he was crazy until the weather proved him right. Then suddenly everyone wanted to learn from the crazy Ukrainian. She thought it was funny, like people couldn't believe someone from the old country might know things they didn't. That attitude, the assumption that traditional knowledge from backward cultures was inherently inferior to modern American methods, was what nearly killed families in January 1887. It had taken 28 below temperatures and dwindling wood piles to break through certainty and create space for learning. The lesson transcended heating systems. It spoke to humility, to the value of cross-cultural knowledge, to the danger of dismissing techniques simply because they seemed foreign or unfamiliar. In Aspen Ridge today, no clay oven beds remain in active use. Modern heating, forced air furnaces, electric baseboard, heat pumps, has replaced frontier survival systems. But at the small historical museum that occupies the old trading post, a scale model of Pavlov's design sits in a place of honor. The placard reads, "Kovalenko Clay Oven Bed, circa 1886. Utilized thermal mass principles known to Chinese, Korean, and Russian cultures for over 2,000 years. Introduced to Aspen Ridge by Ukrainian immigrant Pavlo Kovalenko. Reduced winter fuel consumption by 75% while increasing interior warmth by an average of 46 degrees Fahrenheit compared to conventional fireplaces. Proved that dismissing traditional knowledge as primitive often revealed not their ignorance, but ours." Before we close, I need you to do something. Hit that like button if this story taught you something about heating, history, or the value of listening to people from different cultures. Subscribe to this channel because we're going to keep bringing you real survival wisdom that actually works. Not theory, but techniques proven over centuries by people who lived or died based on whether they understood thermal physics. And drop a comment telling me, what traditional technique from your culture or region do you think modern people have forgotten? Let's build a knowledge base that actually respects where wisdom comes from. The clay oven bed of Aspen Ridge wasn't a miracle. It was memory. Memory of cold winters survived, of knowledge passed from grandfather to grandson, of civilizations that solved problems through patient observation rather than arrogant assumption. Pavlo Kovalenko didn't discover anything new. He simply refused to forget what his ancestors had learned, and in remembering, he saved lives. That's the real lesson. Not the physics of thermal mass, though that matters. Not the construction techniques, though those are valuable. The real lesson is this. When someone from a different culture offers knowledge you don't understand, maybe, just maybe, they're not the fool. Maybe they're remembering something you've forgotten. And maybe, if you listen instead of mock, you'll learn something that could save your life. The winter of 1887 taught Aspen Ridge that lesson the hard way. The question is, will we learn it, or will we wait until our own January 12th forces the lesson upon us?